Good afternoon. My talk is called All Was Foreseen, Nothing Was Foreseen. And I think you'll recognize some recurrent themes from the previous lectures. Those of us who are lucky enough to reach our 8th decade of life are often aware of having crossed a line we were not aware of crossing at the time, the line between being a person with the future and being a person with the past. Not that we don't hope for a little more future, or look forward to it in expectation of continuing fulfilling work, but our past has become a resource for us, and if we're historians, our experiential memories have mingled with whatever we find in documents and books to create the thing the great German musicologist Karl Dahlhaus called wissenschaftlich gefasste Erinnerung. That was his definition of history, systematized recollection, I guess you'd say, in English. Our lived experience helps us in the task of ordering our observations and inferences and making them meaningful. And thus, by informing our daily thinking, our past remains present to us. So now that I've been asked to offer some reflections on my life and work, I've been thinking with greater concentration than ever about my own personal past, and that's what's prompted my title, with its bow towards a paradox that I think many of us will find familiar. In one sense, the story of my life is so simple and straightforward that it could be summarized in one sentence. At the age of 5, I went to school, and I never left. In fact, if you'd asked me when I was 6 what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have said a professor. I visualized myself even then with a gray beard, standing in front of a class and lecturing. And as you see, I have it, the gray beard, that is. Until 3 years ago, I lectured regularly before classes, and now I still do it quite frequently before audiences of various sizes and in many places. When I was 6, my stereotyped mental picture of myself as a professor included a cap and gown, which American professors wear only once a year and never wear in the classroom. But other than that, you might say that my life and work were entirely foreseen by the age of 6. But you would be wrong. My path to what I foresaw for myself did not run entirely smooth. And although I did end up in the classroom, for scholars, that only describes the job, not the work. The job is what earns the money that supports the work, or as I used to joke, the money that supports my habit. The work is the activity that produces the creative output. The job enters into it, but only as one strand in a skein. And when I think of the course my creative work has followed, I'm always amazed at its contingency. Nothing about it was straightforward. Nothing was predictable. So much was the result of happy accident, so much indeed that I half believe in providence, even though I cannot profess any religious faith. I used to remind my students that a significant career requires 3 things: aptitude, ambition, and luck, which is to say, we need the ability to do the work, the capacity to formulate our own goals. We also need the drive that motivates us to persevere in often arduous pursuit of our goals. And we also need the opportunity that makes it possible to reach our goals. We are responsible for the first 2, that is, the ability and the application, the ambition. And we can prepare ourselves to seize the third, which is to say opportunity, but only if opportunity knocks. And that's a matter of chance. As our language tells us, at least the English language tells us, by making one of the meanings of chance a synonym for opportunity. It was chance that made a musicologist of me to begin with. Music was my consuming interest as early as I can remember, even as I nurtured the ambition to be a professor. My mother was a piano teacher, and she started me on piano lessons at the age of 8 with a friend of hers as my teacher. She knew better than to teach me herself. My father was an attorney and an enthusiastic amateur violinist, and very early in life, I was informed that I would eventually play the cello so that we could have a family trio. I started those lessons at the age of 11. At the age of 13, I went to New York City's Special High School for Music and Art, where I learned music theory, and I started to study composition. It was no means a foregone conclusion, though, that when I became a professor, it would be of music, even though that is what I eventually did. There was family pressure, as so often there is, to choose a better-paying profession than an academic one, and there were other interests that unexpectedly impinged. The most compelling of these was a result of a surprising event that befell my family. Both of my parents were American-born children of Jewish immigrants to the United States from what was then the Russian Empire. My father's family came from what is now Latvia, and my mother's from what is now Ukraine. Both of these territories were in what was known as the Pale of Settlement, the area on the western fringe of the Russian Empire where Jews were permitted to live. And those were precisely the territories that were occupied by the Germans during the Second World War. My grandparents were sure, and I grew up believing, that we had no relatives left in Eastern Europe. Any who remained would have perished during the occupation. And then, in 1958, when I was 13 years old, and after 3 of my 4 grandparents had died, we learned to our amazement that a whole family of cousins of my father had moved after the Russian Revolution to Moscow and had grown up and flourished there. A delegation of rabbis from America had gone to the Soviet Union for a tour, and they were met by an official guide whose surname was familiar to one of the rabbis, who had a man with the same name in his congregation at home, happened to be in Los Angeles. It turned out that the 2 men with the similar names were half-brothers, and both of them were first cousins of my father. My father, who grew up speaking Yiddish, which was the language of the Eastern European Jews, began writing to his cousin, who sent us a lot of gifts, including, for me, many recordings of Russian operas. I had to write thank you notes in return. I didn't know Yiddish, so writing to my Russian relatives became my first and entirely unforeseen incentive to study Russian when I got to college. It led to an overwhelming interest in that language and its literature, and I actually became a Russian major at Columbia University as an undergraduate. When I started graduate school at the same institution, I returned to music, which was my first love, but now I had a rather unusual bit of equipment for an American music student. I wasn't immediately moved to use it, that is, the Russian language, however. As an undergraduate, I continued to study composition and was as strongly drawn to composition as a field of professional study as I was to musicology. For 2 years, I actually pursued a double program as a graduate student, studying musicology, so to speak, in the mornings and working on compositions in the afternoons. I was hopelessly torn between them. Whenever I was doing musicology, I would think, composition is so easy, all you have to do is make things up. And whenever I was working on a composition, I would think, musicology is so easy, all you have to do is look things up. What finally decided me in favor of musicology as a degree pursuit was an unexpected present. As a topic for a master's essay, which was then required of Columbia students, I wrote about Vladimir Vasilievich Stasov, who was a Russian arts journalist of the 19th century and who was very close to many of the famous Russian composers who were his contemporaries. So close that in my thesis I called him the sixth member of the five. Hearing of this plan, my aunt in Moscow, that was the widow of the cousin of my father who had first made contact with us in America, she persuaded a friend of hers to part with a huge 3-volume edition of Stasov's writings and sent it to me to help with my research. Overwhelmed by her generosity, I determined that I had to find a way to go to Russia and meet her and my other relatives there, and the only way I knew to do this was to apply for a fellowship that would support a doctoral project there. And so I decided that I would pursue the doctorate in musicology, not composition, and that I would write about Russian music. I narrowed the subject down to Russian opera during the decade of the 1860s. Now, I was strongly advised not to do this. Neither Russian music nor 19th century music were generally considered appropriate subjects for research in the American Academy of those days. I'm talking about the 1960s. Until then, I'd been a very obedient student. Indeed, there's an old edition of the so-called Hewitt Catalog of dissertations in musicology in which one can find my dissertation in progress as originally announced on the masses of a composer named Henricus Isaac, who lived in the 15th century, and he was a Flemish composer. That was considered very, very appropriate. But my life had taken some fateful turns, and I now had compelling personal reasons to work in a field that did not promise success in America. What made my seemingly foolish choice of a dissertation topic ultimately profitable could not have been predicted at the time. And besides, another unforeseen turn brought me within a hair's breadth of leaving musicology, indeed, leaving the academy altogether. The first research project I wrote, or paper I wrote as a graduate student, was on a topic assigned to me by the professor who taught the introductory proseminar, which I attended in the fall of 1965. His name was Paul Henry Lang, and he was probably the most famous American musicologist of those days. And his manner of teaching was, by today's standards, impermissibly autocratic. Knowing that I played the cello, he assigned to me what surely seemed the most natural topic in the world, according to his lights and those of the discipline as it was practiced in those days. The transition, as he put it, between the viola da gamba, which was a stringed instrument very popular from the 16th through the 18th centuries. So a transition between the viola da gamba and the cello, which took place in the 18th century, he thought. What I eventually found out in doing the assignment was that there never was such a transition. The early cellists were not former gamba players. And the two instruments belonged to different families, and they had very different social uses. But that's not important. What was momentously important for me at the time was my discovery of the viola da gamba as an instrument that I could play. One of my classmates played it, and I asked her whether I could see her instrument and learn the rudiments of its playing technique. She sensed the opportunity to make a convert, and she offered to get me an instrument that I could practice on and also put me in touch with her teacher. I became the most enthusiastic convert imaginable. You could say that I made the opposite transition to the one that I was assigned to research. I went from being a cellist to being a gambist almost overnight. I practiced the gamba much more seriously than I ever practiced the cello, and much more seriously than I was then doing musicology. It really took over my life, and if I had had the chance, I would have made it my profession. And I almost got the chance. A few years after I'd begun playing, the New York ProMusica, the leading American performing ensemble for early music in those days, and the only one in the country that could pay its members a living wage. I believe it was $12,000 a year. That was a living wage in 1970. They advertised an opening for an unspecified string player. Both gambists like me and lutenists who played by plucking the strings, they both applied. After the auditions, the group let it be known that the choice would be between the top gambist and the top lutenist, that is, between me and one of my closest friends who had auditioned on lute. They kept us waiting for more than a month before announcing that they had decided on the lutenist. I was dashed. It was perhaps the greatest disappointment of my life. If I'd been offered the job, I would have accepted it with joy. I would have withdrawn from the doctoral program at Columbia. I would have become a full-time performing musician, and I would somehow have had to justify that decision to my grieving parents, who would have regarded the decision as a fatal mistake. But I never had to disappoint them like that. I don't even think I told them that I'd applied for the job, and once I'd not been appointed, I didn't have to tell them. So I went back to Columbia, tail between my legs, and I resolved on going through with the decision I'd already described to you to get a fellowship for a year's study in Moscow and write my dissertation on Russian opera. I did this very reluctantly and in a state of dejection. And now I will depart from strict chronology and fast forward, as we say, a dozen years to the early 1980s, long after the New York ProMusica had dissolved, after I had earned my doctorate and joined the faculty of Columbia, and where I was by then the director of graduate studies, that is, the person to whom applications for admission to the program were addressed. And who do you think addressed an application to me? None other than my old friend, the lutenist, who had beat me in our competition for a job with the now defunct New York ProMusica. She was now out of work and belatedly seeking a degree in musicology that would enable her to find academic employment. I said a silent prayer of thanks for my narrow escape from her fate, to the providence in which, or in whom, I have believed ever since. Now, what I'm calling providence is, of course, contingency, or fortuity, or blind luck, which can come in all kinds of surprising disguises, including apparent failure in a performing career. Other manifestations of blind luck in my life have been undisguised, and so abundant as to destroy completely any idea I could ever have had that I owe the successes I've enjoyed solely to my own efforts and deserts. There is, for example, the matter I've already promised to explain, namely how my foolish decision to write a doctoral dissertation on a topic as unpromising as Russian opera eventually bore fruit. When I finished my dissertation, it certainly seemed like what we call a white elephant, a possession, according to the dictionary, that is useless or troublesome, especially one that is expensive to maintain or difficult to dispose of. That was my dissertation. What one normally does to dispose of a dissertation, in addition to seeking publication for it as a book, is to get individual chapters published in articles in professional journals. I didn't think there was any chance of doing that, considering the predilections of academic musicology and the editors of its publications. And then, one day, in 1976, the year after I had received my degree, I read an advertisement in one of the standard musicological journals that a new musicological journal was being launched at the University of California by the University of California Press, and with the trio of University of California professors as editors. The journal, unbelievably enough, was to be called 19th Century Music, and its stated purpose was to gain acceptance and currency for that repertoire within the American Academy. The advertisement ended with a call for submissions. It was a perfectly crafted answer to my unstated prayers, and I feverishly produced a version of my dissertation's opening chapter, modified so that it would be self-sufficient rather than part of a longer narrative, and I sent it off, this time with an actual uttered prayer. And several weeks later, I heard back from the senior member of the editorial team, Professor Joseph Herrmann of Berkeley, who was, if Lang was the most famous, surely the second most famous musicologist of those days, telling me that my article was accepted and would appear in the maiden issue of the new journal. In fact, it appeared in the second issue, but I wasn't counting, and I wasn't complaining. The new journal did not only provide me with an outlet for a dissertation chapter, it was my scholarly home for the next several years, during which time I published 4 articles on Russian music, including a major study of Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov that was serialized in 2 consecutive issues, so that my byline appeared in 5 issues out of the journal's first 12, and I began to have a reputation. But this was not the only benefit I derived from this particular providential intervention, or even the major one. Becoming acquainted with Joseph Herrmann was the real life changer, culminating eventually in my moving, together with my growing family, to join the Berkeley faculty in 1987. Joe Herrmann was on a mission to change musicology in fundamental ways, and luckily for me, he saw my work as useful to him in that endeavor. In return, I had the benefit of his editorial hand, one of the most formative experiences in my life as a writer. The most formative experience, however, was another that came to me just as fortuitously. One day in 1984, I was sitting in a restaurant near the Columbia campus, having breakfast and reading the newspaper, when an old friend showed up and told me some interesting news, that one of his friends, having bolted from the staff of a record collector's magazine called High Fidelity, was starting up his own, more serious magazine to be called Opus, and was looking for writers. Shortly afterwards, a Slavic scholar on the faculty of the University of California, whom I had met at a Stravinsky Centennial Conference in 1982, passed along to me a reviewing assignment from the New Republic, which is a journal of political opinion, which he, my friend, was forced to decline because of a conflict of interest. And that's how I was put in contact with 2 editors, James Aistreich of Opus and Leon Wieselt here of the New Republic, with whom I collaborated regularly for almost 30 years, and through whom I became the one American musicologist to appear regularly, not as a critic, but as a book and record reviewer and a musical commentator in the mass circulation press. I became America's public musicologist, as I was often called. You can already see that it was pure happenstance that gave me my opportunity to become that. But it was even more fortuitous than that. I started writing for Opus magazine in 1984, and the magazine folded in 1988. My second biggest career setback after being rejected by the New York ProMusica. For 2 years, I thought my little fling as a public musicologist had ended. But then Jim Aistreich got himself hired as the Sunday music editor at the New York Times. He began remustering his old troops, as he said. And that gave me access to the largest audience a writer on classical music in America could ever dream of having, the readership of the New York Times. Between 1990 and 2012, I published more than 60 pieces in the New York Times. I lasted there because I found it congenial to write about music in relation to what are always the primary concerns of any newspaper, that is, social and political issues. And I would be very surprised if that stint as a very public and often controversial commentator did not have a great deal to do with my standing up before you today as a Kyoto Prize laureate. It was far from what anyone would call my most important work, and far from what I would hope to be my most lasting work. But however ephemeral, it was the work that brought my name to the attention of a readership that extended far beyond the walls of the Academy. But more important to me than that, the New York Times gave me my most rigorous and valuable training as a writer. Saying what I had to say within the confines of a newspaper column taught me a lesson few academic writers ever learn. It taught me to be concise. Now, people often laugh when I say that, because I'm known for writing outlandishly long books. My monograph on Stravinsky's so-called Russian period occupies 2 fat volumes and totals about 1,800 pages. The Oxford History of Western Music was originally published in 6 volumes and ran to more than 4,000 pages. But I have always striven, and I've exhorted my pupils as well, always to use the fewest possible words to say what you have to say, no matter how complex the argument and no matter how many parts it contains. And I firmly believe that it was only because I can, as they say, write short, that I could persuade my publishers to issue books that long. The New York Times taught me how to do it. And if I had not been sitting in the right restaurant on the right day in 1984, I never would have learned. And by now, I suspect you're convinced that, like everyone else, I stumbled blindly into what, in retrospect, looks like a coherent career. How it happened may be an interesting story, and I hope it has been, but it's an ordinary story. All careers look coherent in retrospect, but are likely to have been blind stumbles in prospect. And that observation contains an important lesson for historians. Historians who are often tempted by their knowledge of events and their outcomes to construct deterministic narratives and even look for the laws that govern them. That is a folly that has led not only to a lot of bad historiography, but also to massive human suffering, because historical determinism is the natural ally of totalitarian politics. But the fallacy of determinism is easily detected and described, and my little history of my own career shows how. It's only when we regard events in retrospect that their causes look like causes in the narrowest sense. What determinist historians do is construct their causal narratives backwards from the known outcomes, and then, forgetting that the past was once the future, they recount them forwards with equal assurance that causes, which are in reality only anterior events and conditions, inevitably beget effects, which are in reality nothing more than outcomes. That fallacy is what turns contingencies into apparent necessities. There was nothing inevitable, for example, about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which no one foresaw until it was upon us. As there was nothing inevitable about the collapse of the Tsarist Empire before it. There was nothing inevitable about the so-called collapse of tonality in 20th century music, which, as I argue in the Oxford History, never actually took place at all. And nothing inevitable about the shape of my career or anyone else's career. Nothing in any of these events could have been foreseen. As Alexei Yurchak put it in the title of his wonderful book on the Soviet demise, everything was forever until it was no more. So that's the end of my sermon, but not quite the end of my lecture, because I have not yet told you about the most astonishing contingencies that have enabled me to do the work that I've been able to do. The first time any work of mine made waves within the profession was when I proposed that what was then called authentic performance practice, that is, the revival of old ways of performing old music, that this was not, in fact, the revival of historical performance styles, but rather a newly invented style that took its bearings not from the aesthetics of the past, but from the aesthetics of modernity. It was indeed a modernist style, passing itself off, as modernist styles often tend to do, as a historical revival. When I first advanced it in 1981, the idea was regarded as counterintuitive, to say the least. But by the time I gave it its most extended exposition in an essay published in 1988, it had won some currency, and by now it's the accepted view. What made it ultimately convincing was the evidence I was able to present in support. I remember vividly the first time I encountered that evidence. I had just begun to do the research that led to my monograph on Stravinsky. I came to Stravinsky for my previous study of Russian music, which began, as I've already mentioned, with my formal degree exercises, my master's essay of 1968 on Stasov, and my doctoral dissertation of 1975 on Russian opera in the 1860s. At the same time, as I've also already mentioned, I was heavily engaged in the performance of early music as a viola da gamba player, and also by then as a choral conductor. These two aspects of my professional activity, Russian music research and early music performance, were quite unrelated in their origins, and they were quite remote from one another in their purview, and they had never touched, nor did I ever expect them to touch. They amounted, in Franz Liszt's expression, to a sort of vie bifurquée, a musical life divided, and I should say very happily divided, in two. But now that I'd embarked on a study of Stravinsky, I needed to acquaint myself with the basic texts of aesthetic modernism. Since the best way of learning a new subject is to teach it, I announced a seminar on the theory of modernism, and I began reading in preparation. One day, sitting in my office preparing for the first meeting of the class, I read two texts for the first time. Speculations, which was the collected papers of T.E. Hume, a British critic who died in 1917, and La deshumanización del arte, or the dehumanization of art, by the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset. And this was one of my great eureka moments, because I immediately recognized in their words the discourse that reigned within the world of early music, and that had no counterpart at all in the actual historical texts on which the early music movement professed to base its practice. Once I'd realized this, it was easy to see that what we were calling authentic or historical performances of old music were no more like performances of the music, no more like performances the music would have had when it was new, than a neoclassical concerto by Stravinsky resembles an actual concerto by Mozart or by Bach. The assumption that the radical 20th century break from romantic or 19th century performance practice was in fact a return to 18th century and earlier ways of performing was spurious. It was easy to show that the performances we were giving now did not have 18th century counterparts. Now everyone can see this. Why was I the first to see it? Only because, quite fortuitously, my musical life had been divided the way it was into those two seemingly unrelated and unrelatable Russian music and early music halves. Only because I came to the reading of modernist texts, having been trained in early music, did I see the correspondences that are now almost universally acknowledged. If, with my idiosyncratic and fortuitous combination of interests, I had not made these discoveries, it's possible that no one would have made them. I was not uniquely gifted. Certainly I was not clairvoyant, but I was uniquely equipped, and that was a matter of merest, sheerest chance. And now for the most improbable and therefore most amazing set of contingencies of all. When I began my research on Stravinsky, I did not have in mind an ambitious plan comprehensively to study his early development in Russia and his early works against that background. I couldn't hope to write such a book because there was a practical impediment. Stravinsky had kept most of his manuscripts in his personal possession, and after his death, possession had passed to his heirs, who were divided into two hostile groups: his three surviving children on the one hand, and his widow, not their mother, but his second wife, and his assistant, Robert Kraft, on the other. From the moment of Stravinsky's death, his estate was in litigation, and in consequence, it was inaccessible to scholars. My own early inquiries were answered always very discouragingly by lawyers. Imagine then my elation when I received a phone call from a former graduate student at Columbia who was then employed as an assistant at the New York Public Library to inform me that the New York Surrogates Court had awarded the library temporary custodianship of the Stravinsky estate while its disposition was being adjudicated. That the library had made it a condition that as long as it had custody, the contents of the estate would be made available to the public, and in consequence that I now had free access to it, at a time when I lived a 10-minute subway ride from the library, and blessing of all blessings, I had just begun a full year's sabbatical from teaching that coincided almost exactly with the duration of the library's custodianship. For 10 blessed months in 1983 and 1984, I virtually lived at the library, where I had a freedom of access to Stravinsky's manuscripts that no one has today, no one has had since, because I was able to examine and handle the actual physical documents rather than microfilms or photocopies, which the Paul Zacher Foundation in Basel, Switzerland, which was the eventual purchaser of the estate, now only permits under exceptional circumstances. So when I tell people that I actually handled Stravinsky's manuscripts, they look at me with such envy. This was a stroke of fortune such as I have never had before or since, nor has any other scholar that I know. But I've had many others, not as spectacular perhaps, but also crucial determinants of my life's course. I could go on regaling you with stories of my lucky life, but I'm sure I've already told you more about it than you ever wanted to know, and you are already perhaps wondering whether I really deserve a prize for receiving so many blessings. I wonder too, and in my acceptance speech yesterday, I already said that no one can truly deserve such an award as the one you've seen fit to bestow on me. I also know from rumblings that have reached my ear from afar that my particular field of endeavor has made the award in certain quarters all the more a cause for wonder and even for a bit of annoyance. In announcing my selection, the Inamori Foundation seemed to anticipate this, taking note that a precedent had been broken in giving a prize that had formerly gone to composers and performers to a writer on music, and that perhaps explanations were in order. To honor my work, the foundation stated in the citation, was to acknowledge that in music, creativity can be found not only in composition and performance, but also in meticulous discourse contextualizing the art. I will count it as the greatest of all my blessings if this generous assessment, not only of my work, but of my field of endeavor as well, should set a precedent whereby it will not look so strange the next time a musicologist is taken as a worthy recipient of a prize in music. That it was my work as a music historian that should have occasioned this broadening of the prize's purview is, of course, gratifying to me, but it too is attributable to newly propitious circumstances. It's widely acknowledged in the historical profession that the influence of economic and social globalization has brought about a global turn in historiography as well, whereby, in the words of Richard Evans, the eminent historian of 20th century Germany, historical reputations are not made with narrowly empirical monographs, but with novel concepts and methodologies, new interpretations, and large-scale, ambitious works of synthesis. Well, for better or worse, that's me, with my 6-volume Oxford History of Western Music, which owes its existence, as by now should go without saying, to another set, or rather a whole chain of unforeseen and unforeseeable lucky breaks. But from these fortuities has emerged perhaps a measure of poetic justice. Musicology, I seize my opportunity here to declare, deserves its recognition among musical pursuits. That it should be regarded as secondary to composition and performance, that, for example, Jean Sibelius, the Finnish composer, speaking on behalf of composers, should have been thought wise to observe that no statue was ever put up to a critic. Well, that's only a prejudice based on historical happenstance. There have been other views. The philosopher Boethius ranked the 3 types of people who concerned themselves with music in precisely the opposite order. At the bottom were performers who, according to Boethius, whose efforts are devoted to the exhibition of their skills with instruments and who therefore act as slaves without reasoning or thinking. That's Boethius, not me. In the middle came what we would call composers, but Boethius called them poets, which in Latin simply means makers, who compose more with their natural instinct than through the exercise of thought or reason. And on top were people like me, whom Boethius exalts by calling them critics, which is Latin for judges. Those who, because they are wholly devoted to reason and thought, are able to judge modes, rhythms, the genera of songs and their mixtures by virtue of their ability to use reason and thought in a manner especially suited to the musical art. So there. I won't insist on that hierarchy or any hierarchy, but I do think that we who tell the story do get the last word, and we deserve recognition for that. Those who presume to outrank us forget that we're the ones who have assigned them their place. One of my favorite stories, and for reasons you will surely understand, one of the favorite stories of my pupils, to whom I loved to tell it, concerned the great Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, who, when warned by one of his teachers that he should be more respectful towards his elders because it is we who will determine your promotion, he answered, "Yes, but it is we who will write your obituaries." I read that, by the way, in Myrdal's obituary. The quip has a particular relevance to the fantastic honor you have done me by recognizing my work as a musicologist alongside that of so many truly eminent composers and performers. With the exception of Cecil Taylor, who works within a tradition other than the one I have taken As my beat, I have written about all my predecessors, in some cases quite extensively. And in all cases, I have striven to do as the Kyoto Prize citation has noted. I have striven meticulously to contextualize their art. And I have not always been thanked for it. Contextualizing has meant describing their work seriously in the way I have described my own work today in a more ironic or parodistic vein, in terms of a dialectic, a push and pull between a more or less powerful agent and the enabling and constraining conditions within which the agent acts. In my own case, I have spoken somewhat simplistically about luck. What I meant, of course, is that like all agents, I could only exercise my abilities within a particular circumscribing environment. Like my predecessors, I strove to make the most of my opportunities, or what we now prefer to call affordances. And in this, I was aided by my ambition and the strategies I was able to contrive in order to realize it. To speak of enabling conditions, and particularly to speak of ambition and strategy, has often seemed to those used to a more idealizing or decorous account to diminish the achievements of the great. But even those who have opposed my work, and believe me, I have been battered as well as flattered by its reception over the years, even they must be aware, if they're capable of introspection, that their own activity has been subject to constraints that they have had to negotiate through strategy. The implicit endorsement the Kyoto Prize has given my efforts and my methods, if it serves to encourage a more realistic and informative historiography of art, gives me additional reason, and the most powerful one of all, to be grateful. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。それでは講演をしてくださいましたタラスキン博士に花
Thank you
束
very
の
much.
贈呈でご
So
ざいま
now
す。
we'd like to present a book of flower to Dr. Taruskin.
タラスキン博士ありがとうございました。
Dr. Taruskin, thank you very much.